Hi, everyone. This is Rochelle, one of the Design System podcast producers. We wanted to give you a heads up that we talk with people from all over the country, and sometimes, depending on how we can record with them, it can affect the sound quality. Because of this, sound quality may vary episode to episode, but we hope you still enjoy the podcast.
Welcome to the Design Systems Podcast. We're all about the places where design and development overlap. We talk with the industry experts about trends in design, development, and take a look at new ways to build digital experiences, typically over a beer or two. On the program today, we have Tatiana Mac. She's an independent designer and a front-end developer. Welcome, Tatiana. Thanks so much for taking the time out of your busy travel schedule all over the world to spend a little bit of time with us chatting about design systems today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So where did you just get back from?
The final trip of 2019, which is so exciting to say. I just got back from Amsterdam.
Oh, awesome. Did you have a great time?
Yeah, I love Amsterdam. So
awesome. I've only ever been in the airport. I really want to go explore that city someday. So
I highly recommend it. I would say that the airport there, though, is one of the best. Like, if I have to do a tight transfer, I know that they're going to get me through really quickly there. So awesome. There could be worse airports.
Yeah, definitely. What little traveling I've done in Europe has kind of been in and out of there. But so, you do a lot of talks about design, about inclusivity, about a lot of different topics related both to your work and to your passions. Tell me a little bit about some projects you're working on right now.
Yeah, so a lot of the projects I work on outside of doing talks tend to be squarely within design systems and working within design systems on a couple of very different fronts. I've done work where it was finding ways to expand the design systems to create a more lively and energetic illustration and UI style to pair with the design system. And a lot of that work is in really kind of, I would say, dull industries like security, where it's very challenging to find things like dynamic imagery, right? Like, you can only have so many images of someone running through a server room. Mm-hmm. And then on the flip side, my work is, I would say, highly technical in the accessibility space. So accessing design systems to ensure that the individual components themselves are accessible, and then ensuring that as a design system is being manifested and used, it remains accessible.
Great. So aside finding images of locks and keys and matrix code and stuff like that, scrolling by, talk to me a little bit about what you mean by ensuring accessibility of components. Like, what does that look like in practice?
Sure. So I think when we are looking at the accessibility of a site, we're using auditing tools to access the full site as a whole and how it comes together. But we have a lot of influence over the accessibility from when we're crafting each of the individual components. So if you're looking at something like the way in which a button or an input like a search form is being coded, the way that you code that into your design system is going to be copied hundreds, maybe thousands of times, depending on how large your code base is. So I like looking at things from that really specific component-based level because it saves me a lot of work in the end when I'm doing the full accessibility audits.
Yeah, if it works in the component level, it's going to work in all the implementations of that component all over the place.
It's kind of maximizing and taking advantage of the fact that designers and developers tend to be lazy. We love copying and pasting, but if we're copying and pasting something inaccessible, we're going to be pasting something inaccessible. So that's why it's so important to start at that molecular level.
Yeah, that sort of modular, encapsulated approach to things really lends itself to all kinds of testing. When you talk about specifically accessibility and accessibility testing, are you talking about things like Lighthouse and tools like, the other name is escaping me, is it Axure?
Oh, you're thinking of Axe Core?
Yes, yeah. That's it. When you're using those kinds of tools, are you actually running those tests in the design system as people are coding and building these components and releasing them? Or are you thinking about this as more of like an implementation kind of problem where the consumers of that design system are then responsible for their set of testing that they also run on those components?
I've been lucky enough to do both, and they both are excellent for different reasons and suck for different reasons. So I've both worked with design systems while they're still being crafted, which is really lovely because you can have a lot more holistic influence over how accessibility is integrated into the language of the design system and how it's being spoken about. But then also I've worked with really quite baked old archaic design systems that were inherited from print style guides, right? Mm-hmm. That have been quote unquote transformed completely into a design system. So I've done a bit of both. And I would say, to answer your question about who's consuming it, I think that's the thing with a design system, is that it's being touched at so many points. Not only the creators, but also the maintainers, and then the executors, and then of course the consumers. They consume a design system even if they don't realize it.
Definitely. Yeah, and you mentioned content, not just content for the design system, but content for, what ultimately gets consumed by these products. So when you think about content in a design system and specifically like the accessibility of that content, where do you look to?
Well, I think this is an area where you have to look at things from several axes. I think that making the content accessible both has like a technical standpoint, but then it also has an inclusion standpoint, which is if I look at a website for a security firm and I'm doing this shopping, let's say that I'm working on a team and I'm reporting to a CTO and looking for some software, if I don't see anyone on that page who looks like me, that's going to give me a sense of the experience I'm going to have as a woman of color is going to possibly be not great. That's another level, is like what imagery you're using will tell your users who's welcome there and who's prioritized there.
Right. It's a reflexive response to the content that people are seeing. And so those people that see imagery and content that speaks to them and their personality and their identity, that's going to make it a more welcoming experience for those groups of people.
Right. Now, to add another layer of that, if you do a good job of showing imagery and you clearly searched in your stock images diverse teams and you threw all those images up there, then I go to fill out a form, and your form is asking me to give myself a title like Miss, Mrs., Miss, and you don't include mix in there as a non-binary or agender term, then I'm going to see that you aren't really reflecting the imagery that you're including in your site. So there's kind of like 3 different layers of access that I tend to think about when crafting the content.
So those 3 things are the actual content itself, things like input fields and that sort of thing. I maybe might miss the third one. What were you thinking about there?
So I think that the 3 axes are, is it physically accessible for me given the tools that I use? So whether I am a screen reader user or whether I'm a power keyboard user or whatever assistive technology I'm using. So that pure access level. And then from, do I see people other than those are generally centered within the imagery and within the being featured on the site? So that can both be just actual images and who's on their staff page. And then the third level is, are you actually understanding those principles of inclusion in the ways that you're collecting information? Why are you asking me for gender? Is gender necessary? If you need to ask for it, then are you doing a good job explaining that to me? How are you treating my privacy? Those are all things that are interconnected between accessibility and inclusion.
On an aside, I've actually always wanted to ask somebody that is an expert in this area this question. So if you're a person that has a sight impairment or you're not sighted and you're talking about accessible content that speaks to that user group, what does that, and this is not intended to be a bad pun, what does that look like? What kind of content do you put in front of that person that allows them to feel welcome, that there's other people like them that are included in this group of users that you're reaching out to?
Well, I think that it comes back to, have you included them from the research level in order to create it? Do you have anyone who's been included in the creation of it? In accessibility, there's a term we often use, which is nothing about us without us. So it's one thing for a bunch of
where does that come from, actually?
So I've actually looked into the origins of this word, and not for long enough. It's, as an aside, very difficult to track down idioms and quotes. We're very bad at attribution, as it turns out. But it's definitely been connected with accessibility. And someone once told me that it's like an old Polish expression. So I have to look into that a little bit more. But the principle behind nothing about us without us is that you shouldn't be creating anything without the people that you have in mind. There was an article written recently. It was about a review of a bathing suit for hijabi folks, and it was written in the perspective of a woman who's not hijabi, which is she does not wear a hijab. She was, I believe, a white woman. And it was like, of all the writers in the world, why would you pick her? She talked about what it was like to swim around in a hijabi once in her life without understanding any of the cultural implications of living with a hijab and all of the discrimination that comes with being a person of color. And being Muslim. I just read that and I was like, this is the exact problem. So in accessibility, we kind of have the same challenge where if I, as a sighted person, am trying to presume what an unsighted or low vision or vision impaired person experiences, that's not going to be possible. And sometimes we try to like create these tests of like, oh, put a blindfold on. That's not the same. So I think it's about making sure we are including them. And I think the second aspect of that is that we need to parse the technology from the users. So often we conflate screen reader users with people who are blind or vision impaired. Mm-hmm. Well, someone can use a screen reader and not be blind. Mm-hmm. And we really shouldn't be referring to people based on the technology. Instead, we need to be referring to the technology and how it impacts its users and then the people.
Yeah, this breaks into a really interesting topic I just actually saw a presentation about how Alexa is essentially a screen reader, mm-hmm. and how all these devices that now speak to people that are reading web pages and speaking to them in their home. I mean, there is distinction, obviously, but it's another form of that sort of screen reader technology. And there's also a big pushback in accessibility community, and I from what I gather, this is pretty controversial when you talk about like user agents for accessible devices and those sorts of things, and how, you know, that is a very double-edged sword of being able to think about experience, knowing which device that experience is being consumed with, but also the concern that creates a different class of experience for those users than using that assistive technology.
Right. I think that it's a matter of listening to more users is kind of what it all boils down to. And I think that we have a tendency to, like what I said earlier, over-conflate a screen reader user with a particular disability. And we almost think about accessibility as being for the disabled. And it's really not. Accessibility is for everyone. And I think there's, hopefully by this point, it's well documented that if any of us who I'm presuming able-bodied have a temporary situation, we would benefit from accessibility, being able to use an app with one hand. Mm-hmm. Well, that not only benefits someone who has one arm, that benefits someone who has a broken arm, that benefits someone who's carrying their child. It benefits someone who's trying to do something else. So I think that in general, we just need to make sure that we maintain that clear distinction and separation between behavior and technology and humans.
As always, this podcast is brought to you by Basalt, a full-service digital agency. Basalt is committed to building a better web and specializes in creating design systems. Learn more at basalt.io.
When you're talking about empathizing with people that are unlike you, that you need to understand more about, you take a research lens to that. And looking through that sort of research makes me have this question of like, if I have lots of different user groups with lots of different diverse needs, if I can't reach everybody, where do I go to fill that gap?
Yeah, so I think on the first point, I have a very radical stance on empathy, which is that I think empathy is a complete scam. I don't think that you can really empathize with other people, because empathy is the ability to essentially experience what someone else is experiencing from their perspective. I right now don't know what it's like to be a wheelchair user. I don't know what it's like to be a Black woman. And so when we say empathy, I think that it has a few problems, because it's us validating other people's experiences through being able to understand them. And we can't understand everyone's lived experiences. We can only understand our own. So that's point number one. I think that in terms of this idea of, but there's so much research to do, how do we tap into so many groups? I think that we need to, instead of trying to be so holistic, I think we need to instead look at who we tend to center in the research that we're already doing. Right now, what we do is we center the experiences of basically white, cisgendered men, and to some degree, white, cisgendered, abled women as well. And so the people that are most vulnerable are the ones that are societally on the periphery, which is people of color, queer people, non-binary people, disabled people. And so if we invert that and we focus our attention on several marginalized groups, the needs of the majority are always going to be met. The majority is always going to have enough power to ensure that that's the case. So I think that what we have to do is we have to pick people that are in groups that tend to be isolated and ignored and ensure the experience is safe for them, because those people's lived experiences force them to think about their safety all the time. I think about all the technology that we've created. Like, I just read an article about how hackers are now starting to hack into Ring and watching children and speaking to children through the ring.
Yeah, that's creepy.
Right? That's super creepy. But that happens because people that are on the staff for those types of technologies aren't ones that are chronically thinking about their safety. You know, I'm so curious, like how many parents were on that, how many folks of color were on that, how many queer folks that are chronically thinking about our safety. I would guess very few. And I think that that's the thing, is we need to center those experiences because those are the ones centered around protection, safety.
Yeah, and I mean, being a parent of a nearly 2-year-old myself, it's definitely something that I think about a lot in the products I buy and the things that I use. You know, we intentionally have like a baby monitor that's not connected to the internet, for example, right? Yeah. And a large part due to the fact that there's a lot of creepy things that happen with kids these days. And that's, you know, it's definitely top of mind for me. And I think that maybe that sort of thought process might not be baked into all the products that enter the shelves that ultimately do touch children.
So I have a question for you, though. Were you thinking about safety as much as you are now before you had a child?
Oh, certainly not.
And then before you were partnered, I'm assuming?
Yeah. I mean, before I was partnered, I think that I had a different notion of it that is maybe not as big of a change as when I became a parent.
Sure. That makes sense. So when you became a parent, when you were shopping for technologies and someone who works in tech, tell me about your thought process when you're shopping for things.
Yeah, I think that it depends a lot on where the technology is going for me, right? Like the use case for it. If it's something that's in my car that is like, you know, a Bluetooth adapter in my car that's a relatively hackable device, right? Like I don't really care that much if somebody in the car next to me listens to my phone call. What I do care is if it's something in my kid's room, or if it's something that is I'm dependent upon for the safety of my home. Like this, so I don't have a Nest, so I don't have any of the Ring doorbells or anything like that. Because if it's not a physically hardwired connection to something that I own that doesn't go into the cloud, like there's definitely a risk of that data being exposed somewhere. And that's something that is a risk that I'm not willing to take personally.
And that's super interesting because for me, not being partnered and being single and being femme, I do worry about that ability to hack into anything I own at any given point because I'm likely alone and much more prone for stalking. And especially as I become more visible online, I'm starting to think more about like where are all the places on the internet that my address could exist, my phone number.
Yeah, and I can't even imagine, I think people that put themselves out there in the public sphere and speak about topics that stir up a lot of controversy and stir up a lot of strong emotions and feelings in people, I think that safety automatically becomes a major concern. You know, you think about journalists, you think about activists, you think about speakers out in the world. I mean, you even look at like what's going on in places like Hong Kong and India right now and how, you know, the technology that just sort of surrounds us constantly unintentionally exposes those people to a lot of risk.
I would say intentionally exposes those people to a lot of risk.
How so?
I think that we think a lot about and speak a lot about intent, and that's something that another hill I'll die on, is that we focus a lot on the intent of the creator and not a lot on the impact of the user. And I think that anything that's being created in the world that can have malintent has been intentionally designed so.
So I can see what you mean, but I definitely, so like Instagram, for example, right? So you have Instagram pictures and you have things that go up on the internet, and there's people that relatively innocently take pictures of their families out having fun or, you know, plates of food or whatever. And that exposes a risk to people around them that are, like I said, activists or journalists or something like that, where they could unintentionally show up in the background and have like facial recognition tag them or something like that. I can definitely see where that becomes this system that is rife with abuse.
But that's the problem with intent, is that we're focusing on the intent of like the innocent user who's like taking a photo of their family on vacation and accidentally capturing a journalist. There is also intent there from the creator. Instagram, which is owned by Facebook, which is our largest surveillance capitalist corporation right now. And so to me, their intent is to exploit our privacy for money and for political gain. And so that's why I try not to focus on the intent, because we can parse intent forever and we don't really ever know, but the impact doesn't change. The impact is that those people are being put at harm because of this surveillance technology effectively.
It was interesting. I actually had a conversation that was kind of akin to this on the plane flight yesterday back from San Francisco. I was chatting with this woman next to me about web design because she worked for government and climate research. She was talking about how her and her team didn't really view design as a holistically valuable thing for research professionals. And in large part because she's like, I've seen what people call great design, and like I deleted my Facebook account because I didn't find the design of Facebook being compelling. But he points it at things like that as these like beacons of great design. And, that really struck me as kind of a funny thing, right? Where I was like, I don't think that Facebook is being designed for that person as a user. I think that it's being designed to have this sort of darker pattern to it, right? It cultivates addiction, that cultivates this idea of me wanting to provide more content and post more content, because that's ultimately Facebook's intent for that platform, right? Is to have people post more, to have more interactions, to have these continuing engagements with this platform. And the funny thing at the end of the conversation, she goes, but I do like Instagram, though.
Well, see, and that's the thing is like and I invite us to use anti-pattern, because dark being connotated with bad is like another way in which colorism and anti-blackness in particular perpetuates itself. But that anti-pattern of creating something where you have notifications for nothing, right? Like you'll click on it. I deleted Facebook years ago, but I know that it will generate just these red notifications for no reason. And yes, that's certainly addictive, but I would argue, and I think this is what you're getting at, that it's designed as intended and it's working as intended, which is in order to not only get users stuck in it, but to collect as much data about users as possible, and keeping them there as long as possible. I remember when someone discovered, and I don't know if you know this, that there is a lot of metadata that's embedded into photos once you upload them to Facebook. So they become encoded with like tons and tons of data that collects like where they were downloaded from. That's all for surveillance. So it's designed super well. From an accessibility standpoint, Facebook is one of the worst offenders. They do things like parse out different HTML tags in such a way that make it so that ad blockers and stuff don't work. Well, that has a intended or unintended, doesn't matter, impact on people that rely on assistive technologies to use the site. It becomes incoherent to use it with a screen reader or voiceover.
So how can we like push back against this sort of thing? As designers, as tech professionals, what is our role in this? Like, what is our responsibility to take hold of here?
I think that so much of it, and I don't think I ever answered the second part of your question, but it ties to this, which is I think that people that have the most power in our industry, which is people that look like you, need to center the experiences of people who look more like me, and to be able to read about experiences. I think one thing that you asked is like, in lieu of talking to people, what is it? There's so much written and so much trauma that's been turned into words and into videos by people's lived experiences about how difficult it is to exist in this world and how technology in particular intersects with that. I think focusing our efforts on hearing more of those stories, amplifying more of those stories, and centering those stories when thinking about the technology that we create. And then I also think it can be very easy to get futile when you start to think about things. I think especially today with the vote that's happening in the UK, I have been reading a lot of very futile tweets from my British friends. And I think that we just have to remember that we can't ever search for perfection in the accessibility of our design systems or in the inclusivity of our design systems. We can only seek progress, and progress can be incremental and small. And that doesn't often feel like enough, but I find that what happens more often than not is that people want to make such grand gestures in progress, and then they end up doing nothing. And it's like, I don't want you to do nothing, like do something, recognize that it might be small, but small things can compound. So I guess my wish would be for everyone to just take small steps every day to making things better.
Yeah, it's sort of like software development, right? Like you gotta ship something small before you're able to make that big goal.
And for the love of God, write detailed release notes. I'm so sick of reading like performance enhancement and bug fixes. I'm like, what does that mean?
Where did that go? Yeah, it's interesting actually. Like bringing up my particular background and the way that I look and kind of like, who I am. I grew up in a community that was 99.9% people that look like me, and trying to find my way out of like rural Oregon and kind of experience what racism even really was, because the biggest difference between me and the vast majority of the people around me was income and socioeconomic background. It wasn't ever about like skin color or even really sexual orientation, because it just wasn't something that people talked about. Not that those differences didn't exist. I'm sure they were there and present beneath the surface, but trying to go on this like personal journey of trying to be more aware of what other people experience, and yes, I guess build empathy, but in a way that like just trying to broaden my own understanding of the world. What do you say to somebody that is looking to embark on this journey of understanding that maybe comes from a background like mine, or a background not too different than mine, to be a champion and to be somebody that is helpful?
I think it's about, honestly, like the shortest, most concise way I can put it is to talk less and to read and to listen more. Because I think that people that look like you take up a lot of space in tech. And that's because people like you created an infrastructure that was comfortable for people who look like you, right? And so that's that self-fulfilling prophecy, is that if you don't see anyone that looks like you. I just listened to an excellent talk by Angie Jones. She's someone I really admire because she is very present in tech. She's a software engineer, and she doesn't talk a lot about inclusion very intentionally. She did one talk about how to code the future coders, and it was released, and it was great because she talked about being visible within spaces where there's a lot of young Black women and young girls that could see someone who looked like her doing what she's doing. And that's so rare to see someone who looks like me or who looks like her in the industry. So I think for people that see a lot of themselves reflected within the industry, for them to take a back seat and to give up their conference talks and to take up less room in meetings and to take the time to ask questions of the people in the room that aren't being listened to and not being amplified. It's really just about taking up less space.
Yeah.
and using the space that you once took up to leave that space for someone else to fill.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that latter part of that is the part that speaks a little bit more to me, like how to gracefully seed the soapbox, if you will. Yeah, it's interesting, right? Like you hear all these articles about people talking about how they miss like the old days of tech, right? Like when the internet was fun and all this other stuff like that. And my response has changed from like, oh yeah, I feel that sense of nostalgia too, to like, well, who was it actually fun for? And, having it be fun for the people that built it, I think is very different than having it be fun for the people that are a part of it now. And as we go kind of like through this collective evolution of like what technology is bringing to us and all these things like that, I do kind of realize that like there's this sense of receding ownership. And I hope that that's on the right pathway.
Yeah, and I think even that idea, though, of who owns and who created tech is somewhat misinformed, that software engineering was something that women did first.
Yeah, A. Lovelace.
Yeah, and many, many more folks. So I think that idea, there is that like baked idea that tech belongs to like dudes, and it doesn't. They took credit for a lot of the work that was established long before they ever got there. So I think, sure, yes, it's about them ceding the power, but also recognizing it was never theirs to begin with.
Yeah, I think that mostly what I was referring to is the idea of like, the dominant group, right? Like, and trying to understand how that changes.
Yeah, usually it's just stepping down, and also fending off other people that look like you is a big thing, because if you step down from your soapbox and you've done a little bit more work, say, than the next Chad next to you, like they're going to try to take over the soapbox, because that's like what society conditions them to do. So I think another second step is not only stepping down yourself, but then also finding ways to ensure that you're, helping to keep the people that normally would be centered at bay.
So we were talking about other projects you're working on. You before we started recording, talked about this modern approach to a dictionary, and I'm really curious to hear a little bit more about that. Can you describe what that's all about?
Yeah, so my dictionary is called Self-Defined, and it is an open source project that I started this year, which is a dictionary that is made for people to self-define themselves and to create and to perpetuate vocabulary that isn't centered in common vernacular. It really was inspired by this idea that I get a lot of Twitter trolls on a day-to-day basis, and one of the things that they chronically do is paste in the dictionary, i.e. the dictionary.com or Merriam-Webster dictionary definition of racism. And that definition says that racism is prejudice against any race, which completely neglects like infrastructural and systemic racism as being the foundation, and that racism is intrinsically tied to white supremacy. So out of frustration, I created this project not only for the negative points like that, but also so that terms that people don't often hear about, like the difference between bi and pan, or why someone would use disabled versus person with disability. There's a lot of nuance within those terms that doesn't get addressed in mainstream dictionaries. I also saw that dictionaries not only lack that ability to progress rapidly to match social evolution, but also from a technical standpoint, I find that most of the dictionaries don't seem very integrated with modern platforms. And so my hope is to build an API that can allow the dictionary to integrate with things like Slack. So imagine if you could integrate with Slack, and some folks have already created versions of this, but within your Slack community, you could integrate the dictionary. And if someone's about to use a term that's been flagged as ableist or racist or culturally appropriative, it would first alert you and be like, hey, did you know this term means this? Are you sure you want to use it? And instead of being flat censorship, it invites a reflection and invites pause and then makes you commit to your decision. So in addition, on Twitter, being able to have a bot situation where someone could say, self-defined bot, please define polyamory. And then it would kick back the definition for you. A lot of that labor right now is being placed on people that identify in those ways, and those minoritized and marginalized people are tired, of having to define the same things over and over and over. But at the same time, I recognize when you Google stuff, it can be very overwhelming. You can read like dozens of articles and not really get a clear sense. So my hope is to automate a lot of that, create something that can adapt with the times and that utilizes modern technology to do so.
Interesting. And maybe you've thought about this, but how do you prevent the Twitter trolls from infecting that platform, right? Like, how do you make it so that there's some sort of federated idea of what the right thing is?
Yeah, I think that's something that will be a challenge with growth. I think that that'll be critical to having a core group of contributors that help to review, so akin to a board of directors that has very diverse representation. And then making sure that whatever model for approval does have some sort of checks and balances, so to speak.
Gotcha.
Because if I allowed for it to be completely federated, like you said, that would just invite abuse. And because of my lived experiences, I'm always thinking about how the platform can be abused. Definitely.
Well, hey, I wanted to say thank you for your time today. It's been really great to have a chat with you. Very enlightening. as all of the things that I've seen from you are. Keep up the great work you're doing, and don't let the trolls get to you.
Thank you. I will try not to. I appreciate being here and chatting with you.
Thanks so much.
That's all for today. We'd love to hear from you with questions, ideas for new episodes, beer recommendations, or comments. You can find us on Twitter @TheDSPod. Cheers, and thanks for listening to the Design Systems Podcast.